Welcome to today's episode for people interested in the extraordinary, yet ancient and often long forgotten stuff. This is your host, Joseph Schinwald from homebythebeach.com. And our guest today is Heather Conn. Hello, Heather.
Hi.
It's great to have you. Yeah, it's nice to see you. Yeah, on Zoom, right? It's great to have you on the podcast. It's really a privilege, Heather. Did I say your name correctly?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Heather Conn. So you're from Canada, right?
Yes.
Yes. Vancouver. Correct? Vancouver?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I actually live in Vancouver and an area north of there on the Sunshine Coast.
And you told me just recently you don't know really how the sun looks like in winter.
Well, yeah, we joke about that because it rains a lot here.
Yes. Yeah, I hear a lot of catastrophic stories from Canada, particularly from the north. Very cold. People cannot talk to each other because the face is freezing.
Well, no, we don't have that, but in the Pacific Northwest, but we have had floods and droughts, and we're really having the extreme weather of climate change.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I live in Spain on a small island. Even here, it has been snowing. So in the Mediterranean, there is snow on the mountains. Now let's go to the topic. The topic today is being on a spiritual path, like spirituality. I love to talk with you about it because you have been overcoming so many adversities in your life, and you stayed so positive. You brought out your amazing talents, and let's talk about all this. So let me mention a little bit Heather's biography. Heather Conn is the author of numerous books and has been published not only in one or two magazines, like the Vancouver Sun, Edmonton Journal, and Global Mail, as if that wouldn't have been enough, right? She was published in 50 plus magazines and newspapers across North America. Her expertise lies in writing about spirituality and trauma healing and storytelling, and as a writing coach in trauma-related memoirs. So anybody who has trauma, and I think a lot of people have, she actually coaches in writing your memoir about it and about your life. Heather has taught the online creative nonfiction course, Writing from Pain to Power, for the University of King's College in Halifax, and teaches creative writing for the City of Port Moody. Over more than 3 decades, Heather has taught at many venues, including Simon Fraser University and Capilano University. So now, moreover, Heather is passionate about reaching people interested in spirituality and spiritual practices to help lead them to profound transformation, growth, and healing. She shares her own healing in her memoir. And in November last year, she gave a presentation to an audience of 140 about trauma and truth-telling in memoir, the risks and rewards of revealing secrets. And now here for the spiritual podcast Owned by the Beach is a quote from her, which I find fascinating. She says, "From meditation and yoga to 7 months in India, I've spent several decades exploring a variety of spiritual practices. I embrace eclectic spirituality. For me, that incorporates concepts and practices from Tibetan Buddhism to pantheism, and Taoism. My spiritual mentor from about 20 years ago promoted a concept of oneness, which I still follow. I believe in a divine essence that powers and unites us all." So today our topic is on being on a spiritual path. And I want to know how you came to all this incredible spirituality, like Tibetan Buddhism and Taoism and Pantheism. And please, Heather, tell us more about your life and how you became interested in profound transformations, growth and healing, and how you became an expert in writing, and how you started like writing for like more than 50 publications.
Well, those are sort of two-pronged things. I'll start with the writing part first. My mom used to read me stories when I was a kid, bedtime stories, and she was a very, in my view, really had good taste in literature. And I would read adventure stories, and like by Jack London and Treasure Island, things like that, that really felt like they opened the doors to me to want to travel. And I understood the power of words, that they could make you feel like you were living in a different world at a different time. And I really appreciated that. So I actually started typing on my mother's typewriter, just, pecking on it when I was about, I don't know, 7, writing these really overwrought stories. And then as I got older, from a practical standpoint, I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to, so I made the conclusion that I wouldn't be able to support myself as a fiction writer. So I decided to go into journalism, also because I was very passionate about believing that in the power of the press and the power of the word, and that you could change reality. But I had something happen. I've always been a challenger, and if you're familiar with the Enneagram system, I'm a challenger. But anyway, when I was about 16, I spent a summer job as part of an outdoor theater group, and it was from a grant that the local government, this was in Toronto, I think it was a provincial government, and the local paper had given a full-page blurb about how great these grants were. And we were told on the last day of our job that if we were going to do this job again the next year, we'd actually be paid less than we were that year. And so I just thought the disparity between this article that had been giving all these glowing comments about this program versus my experience of it, I found kind of hypocritical. So I wrote a letter to the editor about that, and it caused a big stir. The boss actually called me. I think she got fired or something. Anyway, so at a young age, I saw what impact the power of the press could have, and that really influenced me. There was another incident that happened too. I wrote to actually an artist at Mad Magazine who had totally copied 2 characters completely from a famous artist, and he wrote me back a personal letter. I mean, he could have been sued for that. I was only about 10 when I wrote that to him. Anyway, he wrote me back a personal letter saying, oh, artists like to emulate the people they admire or whatever. But again, anyway, I just saw like, wow, you can have that kind of connection. Oops. Anyway, so that, like, from the writing end of it, I've always been passionate about writing and books. So that's how that got started. In terms of the spirituality aspect,
I have one question about it. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
You said words are reality. How do you mean that in a spiritual way? Like, you create with your words your reality in a way?
Well, I find that words can be used to describe experiences that people often think they're the only ones having them, or they can't find the words to describe something that's happened to them. And I think that's one of the challenges when you're trying to describe something that for you might be a monumental spiritual experience or awareness, and how do you translate that into words on the page? And because often it's an abstract thing and you're trying to find something tangible, concrete to describe it. So words are a reality, but we all define our own reality in certain ways. I think words are just one way to describe that, if that makes sense. So
absolutely, it makes
yeah.
sense. Absolutely, I'm very fascinated with that idea that words, that we are so blessed by knowing a language. And all languages, right? We are so blessed by it. But at the same time, we human beings, we often confuse afterwards the words with the reality. Even though there's always like this paradox, even words create our reality in our minds, in our conversations. Yet words are just a map of reality. Like reality, yeah. And they're ambiguous.
Yeah, that's true. And in any writing, you're really trying to connect the personal with the universal to create on the page something that anyone, regardless of race, culture, creed, language, can understand and relate to. And that's the real challenge, because often people can get too caught up in their own personal stuff and they can't connect it to the broader, larger part. So that's one of the challenges. And like I said, with spiritual writing, that's challenging because often it's an abstract experience and you have to somehow find a concrete way to translate that into something that makes sense to people, and that can be challenging. But you asked me about how I got into spiritual stuff. Well, I've always been a seeker, and I learned pretty early on. I had the privilege I grew up in an upper middle class family, and I learned pretty early on that materialism was not going to solve the world's problems. Like, people can get so caught up in all the material stuff, and it really has, very little importance to me, I think. And so that was one thing that got me starting off. Like, I just realized whenever I achieved something that society said was what's supposed to make you successful, like whether it was a job or award or status or whatever, it didn't really mean that much to me. And so I just thought there's got to be more to life than this. So that's what started me writing. And I remember exploring spiritual stuff. I remember even when I was 10, though I was raised in a Protestant church, and I read something when I was about 10 that talked about in Hinduism, I believe that they believe that when you die, you have different levels of consciousness, and how your life continues is based on that certain, whatever level of consciousness you were at the time, which made a lot of sense to me. And I'm probably not even remotely doing that justice, but I remember that really stuck with me, and I just started to read more. I mean, I read Siddhartha when I was really young.
Yeah, I know that one.
And, all that. Yeah, and so that's what prompted me to go to India. I wanted to just let go of everything, every association, everything I had in North America, and go off to India. And so I did that for 7 months. And
so when you went to India, Heather, didn't you sometimes, like when you think about Hinduism, and my favorite philosophies are Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. I appreciate also the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But when I was in India 2 years, and I was also at an early age, like I was 24 or something, 2 years, and I always these concepts of what the history facts, whether they were facts, probably facts, yeah, like Adam and Eve and Abraham and Jesus and all this. I was so conditioned from early childhood to Judeo-Christian tradition that even I was in India, I hardly could like ignore it, And I had also a spiritual experience before, so I was very into spirituality of Hinduism, because I also read Hindu books, like already when I was 20, 21, but I started also earlier like you, with Taoism, even though I didn't understand anything of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. But when I had the spiritual experience, I read the Upanishads, and I was super interested afterwards in the meaning of my spiritual experience. But always the thing from my culture always came up. It took me a long time to see it like without giving it more importance than anything else, and look at everything like from the point of view that nobody knows anything, and these are all just maps of reality, and these are all just the difference based on different cosmologies, and when you define the word God, and people can actually understand each other. So not to talk more about this, but didn't you also have this kind of strange feeling when you came to India and you stayed there 7 months or 8 months now, that you were kind of conditioned by the culture we grew up?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I personally think we never get rid of that. I mean, I think we always use our own upbringing and culture as the filter for anything that we learn. I don't think it ever goes away. But what I really appreciate as both a writer and a person in general is the kind of archetypal mythic aspect of different religions. I mean, again, that's an aspect in writing. If you can draw on an archetype, that's one way of creating a universal voice that people can understand. For instance, if India has Kali, if you have like the Great Mother or the the Great Essence, however you want, however you want to define it, might
or Shiva,
might use different names, but when it comes right down to it, you're really talking about the same essence in a lot of ways. That's why I really like the concept of oneness. I really appreciate the teachings of Vietnamese Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about interbeing, that we are all interconnected, which is so contrary to how we're the us versus them mentality that we are so conditioned to use in North America. I mean, because you're really talking about patriarchy and the patriarchal values of dominance and control, and that's something that's been so immersed, even in Indian culture too, has had a lot of that. That's very been there for a long time. So as a woman traveling myself too, I had all these projections put onto me that had nothing to do with who I am either, and that was really shocking to me. I write about that in my memoirs.
Yes, I would say, that archetypes of different gods, like the mythologies, right? They are, we confuse them also many times with reality, whereas they're just metaphors, like Kali, or Shiva. It's not real people. It's like metaphors, I mean, for me, at least, everybody's different. And I think that it's a pendulum, a huge pendulum, which went from the masculine, the feminine to the masculine, and goes back to the feminine. And it's evolution, I think, in a sense, particularly when you read the Old Testament, or what is called the Talmud, or in the Islamic tradition, there's also this Old Testament. I studied it, I studied world religions. I got a master's degree, and I just was very interested in it. And I saw clearly that this is absolutely metaphorical, and it was taken by people as a fact.
Okay, I was just going to say, but I think it's important to say that even now, with the perspectives that we have, that even femininity and masculinity are seen as too limiting of terms. We now have what you call gender fluidity, which I think is great, that individuals are feeling now that they're not masculine or feminine, and we've broadened that whole way of being too, which I think is really wonderful. I like that. So, and absolutely. I was also going to say, spiritually, like as a child, I did collage, and then as an adult, I discovered the creative process soul collage, which I'm a trained facilitator in. And one of the things, it's based on Jungian psychology, and one of the things I really love about it is that it does incorporate the concept of archetypes. So you can create these 5x9 cards that are representing different aspects of yourself or an archetypal power, if you want to draw more of that into your life or to celebrate that aspect of your life, you can create a card to do that. You can create a card to represent different influences, either archetypal or in your community. And it's great because you don't use words at all. So I think it's a good balance for me when I'm so immersed in words to do a process that doesn't do, and it draws on your subconscious. I find it's an incredible process. I've done workshops with all kinds of people, and I just find it transformational. I love it. So
Heather, would you please tell us more about the soul collage?
Yeah, soul collage was started in the US by a woman named Sina Frost. She has since passed away, and it's a non-denominational creative process that's based on Jungian psychology, and you create these cards. They're I forget if they're 5x8 or 5x9, and you have different, they call them different suits, using archetypal things, people for influences from your community, and you create cards to honor all these aspects of yourself and the universal archetypes, and then you can interact with them, do writing dialogues, do gestalt things, or just select a card every day as sort of an inspiration. And they can be very therapeutic and healing, especially if you're feeling down or sort of overwhelmed by things. Even when I'm sometimes feel like I can't write about something, I will create a collage because it doesn't even need to make sense. You're just drawn to these images. You don't know why, but it doesn't matter. And it's very powerful and healing. I've seen it used in so many cases, including with my own family, where people didn't really want to talk about something, but just seeing the images prompted a story from them. Or images are a universal language, and that's one of the things I find exciting about it. It draws on our subconscious, and it's great. We might not even be clear about what something means, and then later it could come up and be so obvious what that symbol was. It's very similar to dream work. If you've been in a dream group, it's a very similar process. So I really enjoy that.
They say that image is worth 1,000 words, yet all of it is an image, is a representation of reality.
Yes, and that's what you're trying to do with writing, is to create visual imagery for the reader. And that's what I keep, telling my students and clients, that you need to create description and sensory detail that allows the reader to feel like they're in that situation with you.
Yeah, it's because it's all about meaning, isn't it? It's all about meaning. We have this brain and this heart, and we are able to give meaning to this. And I think we often talk about this big universe, and we think there is something out there which has already had a meaning before we even were born. But ultimately, if you look around and if you just see what is, then I think the perception and the meaning comes from individual souls like us, like every individual person, not even only humans. I mean, we don't know about animals and trees and all this and plants. There's also some consciousness there. Of course, we have the ability to write, to talk with language and all this. But where else would be meaning? And when you're able to write a book, or like you, and then people can actually re-experience this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
re-experience that meaning.
Yeah, and I think that's the writer's role, is to bring a voice to things that other people might experience but don't articulate. Like, that's some people make music. Everybody has their medium. I believe that we're all inherently creative, and we all choose which method we do. I also I do the collage, and I do photography. I've done film, but writing is my primary creative source. And I used to worry that if I did the other things, it would take away from my writing, but now I feel like it just all comes from the same source. Each one feeds the other, so I don't worry about that anymore.
You just said a very it really struck. It was like deep when I understood it, that when you are able to write about the meaning you give to your life and to your experiences, then many people can identify with it and can relive it and can actually identify and relive this meaning you give it to, because they have had some similar experiences and they were not able to express it in their life. And so the person who writes the book, gives them a lot of comfort, because there is another human being out there, and she dealt with it like this, and she expresses it like this, and she writes about it like this, and they can learn from it. Not everybody is able to do it, but you're helping people who want to do it in coaching. So you help people coach writing memoirs, and particularly with trauma-related memoirs.
Well, yeah, and I also reinforce to my students and clients that you need to honor your own process, because I find that what a lot of people do, everybody's trying to look for some absolutist solution. Like they go to a workshop and they hear that some famous writer writes this way, so therefore they think that that's what they need to do. Or someone gives a workshop that says, these are the 5 steps to do such and such. And so people latch onto that and think that that's the only way to do it. And I reinforce, no, everybody has their own approach, and to honor that. You don't, whatever works for you, follow that. I mean, some people start with an image, some people start with a voice. I was actually, when I was in India, I was working on a screenplay, and I started to hear this voice of this goldfish, and it was like a child's voice, and I end up writing 2 kids books. I had no intention of writing for children at all. I knew nothing about writing for children, but I just felt like this was coming from such a deep place that I need to pay attention to it, so I did. So yeah, so one of the important aspects about writing and coaching is to honor each person's process and reinforce that for them. So there is no one size fits all solution. And I don't just give feedback on their writing, but I act as a supporter. I mean, they use the term coach. I mean, that's what it is, just to give them confidence, to support them, to encourage them to go more deeply, to just let them know I've had my experiences, I share what I've gone through, and to just feel that they can be safe doing what they're doing and not worry about approval. And so you're addressing the psychological and the emotional aspects, not just the writing. And I mean, it's something that I find very rewarding. I don't just handle trauma memoirs. I do a lot of other history and other stuff, but the trauma ones are particularly meaningful for me, because I know what it was like for me to write my memoir. I was surprised that even as a professional writer, having written 4 books already, how daunting it was for me, because I had never revealed myself so intimately and vulnerably on the page, and it felt very scary. So I thought, wow, if I'm feeling like this with my experience, what are other people feeling? And lots of people don't want to feel vulnerable because we're encouraged by our culture to not feel that way. That's considered a weakness. But I feel like I had one of my academic mentors said, the more you show your weaknesses on the page, the more that people will be able to relate to you. And that has really stood with me. And I pass that on to my clients too. I mean, nobody wants to put their so-called bad side on the page for everyone to see, but that's what I did. And it's hard to do that, definitely. But also, I just reinforce that what's the choice? Like for me, staying silent was not an option. I just was very clear. And what kept me going when I was getting discouraged was I thought that even if this helps one person, because I had been suicidal at one point, and I thought even if this lets one person choose to not make a difference in their life after reading this, then that will make it worth it. So that's kind of what kept me going in the low times.
So, what was the main factor which helped you overcome your trauma? And I would like you to talk more about it, because it's a terrible thing which can happen to human beings. We come to this world, we are innocent, we have this duality now, we are us and there's the world, and things happen to us we would never believe it would be possible, and we still have to remain the way we are. Let's say, somebody's not kind to you, but you're a kind person. So how do you stay that way, How do you say, well, you know what, you hurt my feelings, but I'm not like you. I remain the way I am. I'm this innocent child in your case. And how did you actually overcome it? And what was your trauma?
Well, in my case, I had to deal with sexual assault from my father when I was a child. And then when I traveled in India, I dealt with sexual assaults from some men in India when I was traveling by myself. So that also triggered some of the things that happened between my father and me. So I think one of the huge aspects of healing from that is having to connect with it in your body, because it's been proven over again that we tend to just shove that down and live in our heads and our minds and not connect with the pain that's in our bodies. So doing body work was really important for me. I did yoga and did incredible vocal releases that I couldn't believe were coming out of my body. It was almost like, where did that come from? Almost as if I had no conscious control over it. And I talk about that in the book. Like, it felt horrible at the time, but when I went through it and came out the other side, it was amazing. And similarly, just dealing with grief, like really connecting with the grief of that, I was sobbing and crying for a long, long time. And again, at the time, it feels horrendous. But, when you think of all the grief that we repress for decades in our lives, that's all staying in the body. And so, releasing it is very healing, even though it might feel horrible at the time. So I did all kinds of different healing modalities, and I was just open to exploring different things, and almost felt like doing an exorcism, like getting all of this stuff out of my body so I could move on. But yeah, it takes a lot of courage to do that. It's scary for sure, but I was lucky to be able to get some professional support and explore different, and I continue to do, like, yoga and meditation have been huge.
Okay. So Heather, you mentioned meditation and yoga helped you a lot in overcoming the trauma. And it's not a unique thing, of course. I want to repeat that. I also had a trauma. Mine was, of course, different, but it was, when it happened to me, I thought it was the worst ever. I also wanted to kill myself. It happened when I was 12 years old. And it was all my life quite a challenge to overcome. And so I met people, all over the world, because I traveled a lot. And I was also in India 2 years and South America almost a year. And then I was another over 20 years in South America. And I know that when I met other people, I realized, well, that trauma which happened to me wasn't the worst thing in the world. There are others, they even have worse ones. And it's like, it's like a pendulum. Sometimes we get also a bigger perspective on life, and we get to know things in life. At least it happened to me, which would have never happened. My life would have never been the way it was if I wouldn't have had my trauma when I was 12. In my case, my stepfather had hit me. The first time I was hit really badly, so bad that he was drunk, and I thought, he's killing me. And it was quite a trauma, because I felt so abandoned by my mother, who actually commissioned the whole thing, and I could never really completely forgive them, honestly. And I still have to work on this also, of course. In a sense, I'm not thinking about it anymore. honest, I don't think about it anymore much, but that this is in my body also. This experience is my stepfather. I can imagine, that this led me to yoga and to meditation as well. And I also found that these two types of spiritual, physical, whatever, liberation is a good practice, because obviously meditation brings you to an understanding of who you actually are. And that is not what you think you are. It's a completely different thing. It's much bigger and it's more connected with the universe and all this. And you can identify with much bigger things than you thought you can, or you should. And then yoga is pretty much the same route. And it's like, there are all these different kinds of yogas. I'm definitely not a karma yoga or raja yoga or whatever, like yogi. I like what is called Jnana yoga, which led to Chan Buddhism and then Zen Buddhism. It's like more or less like I like to understand realities with my mind, with my brain. And then I like to dial it into my body, so to speak, with meditation and with yoga. And not everybody's like this, because some people, they like to, do something devotional, right? Or then others, they like to follow something more scientific. They really, when they do yoga, they sit there and they follow all the rules and the instructions like a science, like in Raja Yoga. But ultimately, I think it doesn't matter. It all depends who you are when you decide on things. Like Carl Jung said, like there are different personalities. And we have to recognize we are one kind of personality.
Well, yeah, you have to find a path that works for you, and for everyone that could be different. There's no one size fits all. And I think as soon as someone starts saying you have to do it this way, I'd say run away, because you really have to honor your own process. And you mentioned identity, and that's one thing that I thought was interesting, because as an incest survivor, I had to sort of reclaim my identity in terms of, I was a lot more than just somebody who was a wounded child and had gone through all that, being, changing from a victim to a survivor and reclaiming that aspect of myself. But then with Buddhism and the concept of no self, then I had to, well, not had to, but I was choosing and still trying to let go of that identity and find that no self. So it's been an interesting process of almost like learning again and then unlearning that. So we all spend our lives trying to define ourselves in some way and to find meaning in our lives. It's just unfortunate that most of us choose something externally based to create our identity. And, I've worked as a hospice volunteer, and you see, even when someone's dying, they say people die the way they live. If you haven't dealt with these issues through your life, when you're on your deathbed, people can either have some interesting new awakenings, or just cling even more to all the things that they felt were them during their life, which weren't really them. It's an interesting process. I just find it fascinating. But the more that people can let go of the external things that define them, I think the more exciting it can be. Even though by materialist standards, it looks like you might be losing, because you don't drive the expensive car, you don't live in the big house, all that stuff, but you take that all away, and then what's left with somebody. And that's why I think, strangely, I like watching some of these true crime shows, because they seem to choose people that have all that materialist stuff from the outside that look like they're success stories, and then you find out what's really going on behind closed doors, and can be all kinds of dysfunction that people don't see. So I just wish that our society reinforced our identities holistically, but they tend to just focus on, like when you read profiles about somebody, they tend to just focus on what the person has achieved externally. We have no idea what they're like behind closed doors, or emotionally. They could be emotionally stunted, but because they're president of some company, then that doesn't matter. So I just wish, to function as holistically as we can, I think, is to be healthier and be a more integrated person.
The whole notion of no self, anatma, which comes clearly from the Buddha, and I don't think it's very different from yogis. It's not a totally unique thing, because ultimately one has to recognize that when we live our lives, when we grow up, we learn a language. It starts like already like you're a little child and you have no idea what is your name. You have no idea. People call you all the time, Joseph, Joseph, Joseph. Suddenly you realize, okay, you point at yourself and you say, Joseph, yeah? But you're not to be identified with that name. You're not a name, you're not Joseph, because they see you that way. So when you are thinking about Buddhism, and particularly the notion of anatman, which is atman is self, and we can talk about the self all day, but what we do is we are just within a map, a matrix. We are not in reality. And that is a fine thing, a beautiful thing to gain meaning, but it's not the way to encounter who you really are. And so now in Buddhism, there's all this interdependent co-origination, like everything mutually arises, and everything in this moment is codependent. Like I codependent, absolutely, right now, with the air, with the sun, with all these things which we take for granted, with the water, with all these things. I couldn't, with my parents even, you and me, we couldn't be alive without the parents. And so we are this individual or universal self in this world, which is so codependently originating from everything else. Yet we are so, in this now, we are so, like the Hindus say, Tattvamasi, we are it, or like the Buddhists explain it as the suchness, the tattata, they call it suchness, that when you come to the enlightenment or the understanding that you are nothing but everything at the same time, because you are so codependently originating with everything else. So without everything else, you're nothing. But at the same time, because you contain everything within you, you're everything, right? It's like a fractal existence. So can you tell me more about your understanding, your unique point of reference of no self? Because the self is a beautiful thing to talk about, as I said, but at the end, it doesn't bring us to the ultimate reality, which is, again, ourselves, but it's not a word. It's
okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say, rather than the term codependent, I would use the term interdependent, because within
interdependent. Yes, sorry.
Yeah,
within
within therapeutic circles, codependent has a
No,
negative
exactly.
connotation.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, no self is there's a lot of different aspects to it. I wanted to also acknowledge the term felt self. Like we can go through life but function basically like a robot, be shut down and not even be connected with how our body feels, how our emotions feel, or anything. Like just go through life just dealing with everything from the mental, intellectual, of which I actually think majority of people do. So to me, no self is when you it can happen in meditation or even in daily life, where suddenly you do realize that there's still the witness self that is experiencing it, but you're seeing and feeling and knowing that it's not like that personality self, or that thing that you are called, that's called you, is just one tiny little dot or seed, that you're an energy self that's part of something so much bigger, that's timeless. And it's exciting, really, I think, to be just energetically to really feel a part of all that. I mean, some people take drugs to to feel that way, but I think you can do it naturally on just through meditation and then even just daily life. So, I mean, I think everybody's experience of no self is different. And to me, it's really tied to the concept of non-attachment. And if you accept the concept of impermanence, that nothing is the same, like they say, you can't walk in the same river twice, that who I am in this second is different in 3 seconds from now, will be different tomorrow. And so the more we can detach from that sense of absolutism, that I am this way and this is the way it should be, and just be as open as we can in any given second to whatever all the senses that we are, what we bring to it, that we are just part of a much, much bigger picture. That's the way I see it, and not have attachment to, oh, I'm a this and I'm a that, and that's who makes me who I am. Like the whole ego-based culture, which, for instance, Hollywood personifies to the extreme. Like everything there is based on achievement, ego, image, all that stuff. And that's why it doesn't surprise me that people in that industry find it so hard to be an authentic self. And I had some sense of that when I was in India, because initially, when I was traveling, I would get these Indian men come up to me and want to take a picture of me with them. And they said that they would tell people I was their girlfriend or whatever. And at first I agreed to it, but then afterwards I felt really used. Like I thought, they have no concept of who I am. They don't know anything about me. They're just responding to me as an image. And that gave me some sense of what celebrities must feel like when they have some stranger come up to them and want to take their picture. Like it's just, they don't know the person, and they're just responding to a certain level of veneer. And so after that I started saying no, I didn't want them to do that, because I felt too objectified by that.
I feel like I have to say something I realized some time ago, that we are not even a part of it. It's the whole thing about being part of this universe. In my opinion, not only mine, it's also like a typical Buddhist teaching that that we are, or a scientific also. Now we know that we are like a fractal existence. So we have everything in us. Like Rome said, you're not a drop in the ocean, but you're the ocean in a drop. So that the universe is not out there. The universe is out there, but also in there. Like Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, which is, of course, a Gnostic teaching of like 111 sayings. He said, the kingdom is not in the sky, then the birds will be there before you. It's not in the ocean, because then the fish will be there before you. It's inside and outside of you. And the inside and the outside, there's some people, they like to go and say everything is just inside, and some people are so lost in the outside, they think everything is outside, like you mentioned a few of those, being attached. But ultimately, it is inside and outside. And why I say this? I say this because that means I'm not a part of it. That means I am it. Like the Hindus say, Tattvamasi. And everybody is. But it's a kind of a reflection. It's a kind of, everybody is a jewel, in a huge jewel that we are reflecting each other. And, it's not like a machine where you have parts. When you take one part out, then the machine doesn't work anymore. It's not like this.
Yeah, thanks for making that distinction. And yeah, in Soul Collage, we use the concept of Indra's net.
Yes. That's what I wanted to mention. I like that Indra's net. It's used in Buddhism and in Hinduism, and it's my favorite simile, metaphor. And that's not what reality is, but it's like a pointer, right?
Yeah, and when we did the training, Sina actually had this giant cloth with sort of netting on it, and she had each of us glue on a little, I forget what it was, like a little sequin or something. And so that really made it real for us to see all these things shining and to reinforce that we are all just this little, hologram. A hologram is a good concept. And I actually made
Yeah.
a soul flush card to represent that concept too.
That simile, which is for me very, very important. I wrote my thesis on it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, my thesis in my master's degree, which I did in upstate New York, and it's very important to me. It's just a simile. However, it shows me that that reality is a dimension. You know, it's a dimension thing. My reality right now is a certain reality. I'm living in time and all this, and in space. But then there are other dimensions in me, which are timeless and spaceless, and where I can say, look, I am this whole universe. And everybody can do that, you know. Everybody is like this, and everything is like this. I mean, even if you look at the most beautiful flower in the field, like William Blake said, you know, I don't remember anymore his poem, but basically said, you know, in a grain of a sand is the whole world, and in the palm of your hand is infinity. And so it's this notion in Buddhism of absolute relativism, where you have small and big, or in Taoism as well, you know, and it's absolutely relative. What is big? What is the big universe? It's just big because it's compared to the atom, to the molecule, to the cell, or to us little creatures. Then it's big, but otherwise, what is small? It's only small because you compare it to the universe, you know. So it's really like when you go in the small worlds, like the worlds of atoms, which is maybe not so different from the big universe. It's also absolutely relative.
Yeah, you mentioned time, and I'd say when I got back from India, that's one of the biggest adjustments I had, because I felt like when I was in India, I'd gotten so used to, because I didn't have any set schedules, I was totally trying to live in the moment as much as possible. And when I got back here and people were asking me, do you want to do such and such in 2 weeks? And I was feeling like, how do I know now if I'm going to want to do that in 2 weeks? Like, that concept just seemed so foreign to me. So I had to readjust to thinking in terms of time as being these compartmentalized little squares, because I hadn't lived like that before. And when I was in grade 7, I actually at school won a public speaking contest about time. I was really interested even then about our concept of time and sort of how limited it is. You know, we look at things linearly, and if you think of the time space continuum as something so beyond how we see it, that's also an exciting concept, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely the biological time. We all know the biological time, you know. There is a physical time, whatever, but then there is a spiritual time, which is the eternal now. And time is different dimensions. I heard once the Dalai Lama talk about the absolute relativism of time. And he said it's very simple. You look like 5 minutes at 5 minutes. And there is in 5 minutes, there's the now, where you experience the 5 minutes. And then there is the past, when you already, let's say we started a conversation which lasts 5 minutes. After 3 minutes, the 3 minutes before, they're past. And then we still have 2 minutes and they are future. But it's all relative to that now, that eternal moment, which we always experience. The 5 minutes could be a day, could be a week, it could be a year, it could be your whole life. But it's all relative to the now. And that is the absolute relativism and Buddhism of time. And in space, they think the same way, basically. That's why the Buddha worlds are everywhere. They're even in your cells, so to speak. You know, Buddhas are everywhere, and it's big and small doesn't really have any relevance because it's absolutely relative. Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I love it a lot. There was another thing I really wanted to ask you more about it, which is, how do you really overcome trauma? Because so many people, like from a spiritual perspective, you know, I don't want to know it from a psychological perspective. I respect the science, particularly people like Carl Jung, whatever. But from a spiritual perspective, why do we even have trauma? Why does it happen to us? And how can you see the positive in it? How can you come out stronger and how can you learn and grow spiritually. This episode is called On a Spiritual Path, right? And so it doesn't matter. When you're completely lost, you're still on a spiritual path if you're still looking for something. But then when you look for something, when you're lost, you're looking for what you think is lost, you're already on a spiritual path. Mm-hmm. And I started once the 10 ox herding pictures. They are like in temples, in Buddhist temples, and that is also part of when I wrote my thesis. And it's a beautiful story in pictures, and you will like it, because if you know it, then you know it, and otherwise I just tell you shortly. These are 10 circles, and it starts with somebody, a little guy who searches, and then he finds something, and it's his own nature. It's a bull in another circle, and he tames that bull in another circle, and then he transcends that bull, realizing that he is not the searcher either. He's not the ego, basically, not the one who searches for it. And then he sits there alone, absorbed in his own self, and then he realizes that he doesn't have a self either. Like the Buddha said, no self. And then it's an empty circle, the typical, symbol of Buddhism and Taoism, the circle, the empty circle. And then, of course, in that 10 pictures, which is called the 10 ox herding, like herding an ox, pictures, comes the Bodhisattva. Before that, it's just, after the emptiness, it's just the universe. And then comes the Bodhisattva, the big guy with the big belly, helping another guy who just looks like in the first picture, who was lost and was searching for something. Now, a lot of people, that's why I talk about it, don't even search for anything. Mm-hmm. And once you start searching, you're not yet on a spiritual path. You are on the path, but you're so far away still from what it is all about, right? That is what I mean, because all of this is actually illusion.
Yeah, for me, the overcoming the trauma is really about connecting with the wounded self, and recognizing that the wounded self is only part of it. It's not who we are. Like, sometimes it's easy to attach to that and identify yourself as that and basically sort of remain a victim. But to me, it's in every sense of ourself, bringing all who we are to the wound and really embracing it, inviting us in. And that's one of the other things I like about Soul Collage, is that it encourages to embrace all aspects of ourselves. Whereas because if you acknowledge that they all serve us in some way, we are more conditioned to want to push away the parts of ourselves that we say we don't like or that are labeled negative. And this is all about embracing it. So embracing our wound and not staying in it, not totally defining ourselves by it, but healing it and bringing it kindness and compassion. And in the same way, viewing our abuser in that way, like seeing the abuser as someone who is wounded in their own way. And that's very different than our standard thing, is to see an abuser as a monster, as evil, as horrible, as different from us. Like, if we acknowledge that we're all on the continuum, I don't even like the word evil actually, but if we acknowledge that we're all on a continuum, and to really see the woundedness in someone else and reach across with compassion, understanding. It doesn't mean you have to condone what they've done, but just to bring compassion, to me, is a really key element. And that's one of the things I really draw on from the Tibetan Buddhism and from the Dalai Lama, is the compassion, and being compassionate for yourself and for the person that you feel has wronged you, and then being able to find forgiveness too, because forgiveness is ultimately about our own healing. It's so that we don't stay stuck in the wound, but it's to forgive is so we can move on and let go. It's not condoning the other person too. And again, I mean, I'm not saying everyone has to forgive. We all make our own choices. But for me, I recognize to be true to my spiritual values and for my own healing, forgiveness was a choice of a path that I made. So
The way I dealt with it was like I went to Kung Fu classes. I got a black belt. I was so tough when I was in India. I didn't go like you, like on a spiritual search. I actually had a spiritual experience, a very deep one, when I came back from 1 year traveling in South America. And it's all in the early 20s. And then I go to India. And there was one time this situation again, similar situation. And I dealt with it so courageously, but so courageously. I sometimes forget who I am and what I actually did in my life, but it would have never happened to me if I wouldn't have had this terrible experience with 12 years with my stepfather. And so, and still, right now I'm learning from you that compassion is a step towards forgiveness. And actually, you are actually liberating yourself, and you have to forgive, because otherwise, it's almost like the Buddha said, when you're angry, it's like holding a hot coal in your hand. That's your anger. And you burn your hands with it because you have to let go. Yeah, Heather, it's such a fantastic and fascinating conversation with you. I'm sure we could talk many, many times, and I could learn so much from you. But I think we are coming close to an hour. And so I think I should bring it to an end, our conversation. So I thank you so much, Heather, for having been on the show. It was a real pleasure and learning experience. And I thank my dear listeners for joining us today. So Heather, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Yes. And I really was looking forward to it, because you seemed to me from the very beginning when I started your website, and again, I want to repeat it. It's heatherconn.com, Conn with 2 N, double N. And there is another one which you can mention also, please. You have several, but there is another one which where you're more
Sunshine Coast. It's Sunshine Coast Soulcollage.ca, and it's Heather Conn, CONN, because some people think it's KAHN, and it's not. It's Heather Conn, CONN.com.
Okay, and the other one has more about spirituality, actually, like your
more about soul
India
collage.
And soul collage, exactly, because those who are interested in soul collage, they can learn about it, and they can also contact you about it, and you have helped a lot of people with it. And I think it's a fascinating thing. I like the I Ching, for instance, also, and as I said, I studied for my master's degree in divinity. I studied the 10 ox-herding pictures, ox-herding pictures. And it was fascinating what you can put in one picture, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can put in 10 pictures the whole journey of awakening. Where, others have written volumes of books about it. But if you study them, it makes complete sense. So thank you very much. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to have you again for our next episode. This is your host, Joseph Schinwald. And goodbye until we meet again.